This is your knitting machine, designed for both pleasure and convenience. We'll now help you enjoy knitting a delightful variety of knitwear, such as sweaters and cardigans. We'll explain step by step how to use this sophisticated machine most effectively. It's always a good idea to read the instruction manual and learn the names of the machine parts before you start working. Before you begin knitting, you will want to prepare a tension swatch. The tension swatch is a test piece that helps you complete the work in the right measurements. Based on the data obtained from the tension swatch, you'll be able to determine the number of stitches and rows needed. To begin, please prepare two kinds of yarn. One is the main yarn for garment knitting. The other is called waste yarn, which is similar to the main yarn in thickness but different in color. First, make sure that the yarn comes out smoothly. Now, let's thread the knitter. Put the main yarn through the rear yarn guide on the right, and then lead it through under the tension pin from behind and slide it into the loop which is placed on your side. Next, put the yarn through the take-up spring and clip it there until you actually start knitting. Adjust the arrow mark of the tension disc to the yarn thickness. If you set it on a minus level, the yarn will become loose. And on a plus level, it'll be tightened. Here, let's set it to the triangle mark. Likewise, thread the waste yarn through the tension unit on the left and clip it there. The tension swatch needs a total of 40 needles, 20 on each side of the center. Now push the knitting needles to B position using the flat side of the needle pusher. Move the carriage across the needle bed a few times to align the needles. Stop on the left-hand side. Now return every other needle to A position using the comb side of the needle pusher. Next, set the tension dial according to the thickness of the yarn. If you set it to a large number, the stitch will be larger. It will be smaller if you set it to a smaller number. In this case, set it to 6. In this example, you'll be knitting in stocking stitch. So, set the part lever and the holding cam lever on each side to N for normal knitting. Turn the row counter dial in the arrow direction, setting it to 0. Now you'll thread the carriage. Let's take the main yarn out of the yarn clip. Hold it like this and push it into the yarn feeder opening. Hold the yarn in gently and move the carriage slowly to the right. Once you feel the needles catch the yarn, you can release the yarn in. The yarn is now caught on the needles in B position. Already completing the first row. Next, hold the cast-on comb with the hooks facing the knitter and hang it over the loops evenly while pulling the yarn with one hand toward you. and you can hook the yarn end under the yarn clip. Hang the claw weight to the central groove of the cast-on comb. If the needles pull forward from B position, just push them back to the original position. Next, the empty needles will be aligned in B position. Be sure to put all needles in position, including, of course, the 20th on the right end. Knit until the row counter reads 10. When moving the carriage, hold the right end of the handle. Move it to the left like pushing, but move it like pulling it when moving it to the right. Make sure that you move the carriage at an even speed to give the yarn an even tension. When you have finished the 10th row, take the main yarn out of the yarn feeder. Hook it on the yarn rest of the machine on the same side of the tension unit. Next, thread the waste yarn into the yarn feeder and knit 2 rows. Now the row counter reads 12. Here, you can cut the waste yarn and place it in the yarn clip. Re-thread the main yarn. If you find the yarn loose, pull it from the back to give it proper tension. Now knit 15 rows. The row counter reads 27. Next, bring forward the 11th needle on each side of the center to E position. Now hook a piece of waste yarn on the 2 needles and bring back the needles to B position to make a stitch. Then knit 15 rows with the main yarn. The row counter now indicates the number 42. Again, change to the waste yarn and knit 2 rows. After this, re-thread the main yarn to knit an additional 10 rows to finish the job. The row counter shows a total number of 54 rows. You can remove the weight and the cast-on comb. Break the main yarn and put it into the yarn clip. Hold the knitting in one hand and release it by moving the carriage gently. The released knitting, that is the tension swatch, is often stretched sideways, so release the stretch by pulling it lengthwise a few times. Then pat it lightly with your palms to make it even. Next, press the swatch according to the yarn quality and condition. Start pressing the wrong side, then turn it over to press the front side lightly. The tension swatch is now complete. When the swatch is dry and cool, measure its size. Measure the width of 20 stitches between the waste yarn markers and the length of 30 rows between the waste yarn rows. This tension swatch measures 10.5 centimeters with 20 stitches and 10.7 centimeters with 30 rows. The adopted standard for the width and length is 10 centimeters each. In this example, there are 19 stitches and 28 rows in 10 centimeters. If you fail to get the desired number as instructed in the manual, adjust the tension dial and try test knitting until you get the proper tension. It is important that you master all we have learned so far: how to handle the yarn, how to operate the machine, and so on, because these comprise the basis for knitting all kinds of knitwear. Now we'll knit a lady sweater. Before we get to work, let's take a good look at the diagram in the manual. The finished size of your sweater will be 108 centimeters to fit a 96 centimeter bust. When knitting a stocking stitch with the tension dial set on 6, the work will have 19 stitches and 28 rows of 10 centimeters. We will start with the back bodice. There are 102 stitches for the back. So push 102 needles, 51 on each side, to B position. Next, push every other needle back to A position. Place the carriage at the left end of the needle bed and set the tension dial to 2. Knit 1 row with waste yarn. Then hang the cast-on comb and the claw weights. Put the waste yarn end under the yarn clip. Next, in the case of the needle adjacent to the end needle, push the 51st needle to B position and knit several rows. Make sure that the carriage is on the right side when knitting is finished. Break the waste yarn and place it onto the yarn clip. Now, let's begin knitting the hem of the garment. Set the row counter to 0. Change to the main yarn and knit 40 rows, double the length of the hem. Push the empty needles to B position to turn up the hem. Remove the claw weights and the cast-on comb. Pick up the first stitch of the first row with the transfer tool and place it onto the end needle. Following this, hook all stitches in that row onto the corresponding empty needles. You've made the mock rib for the hem. Hang the cast-on comb and the claw weights again. Align all needles in B position. Set the tension dial to 6 and row counter to 0. You'll now knit 70 rows to the underarm. Next, place a marker at both sides of the underarm. Then push the needles on both ends to D position. Hook the cut ends of the waste yarn and push them back to B position. Knit 80 rows up to the shoulder. Next, place markers on sinker loops between the 25th and 26th needles on each side to show the neck opening. Then, put the latchet tool through the sinker loop. Put a piece of waste yarn into the hook of the tool and pull it. Push up the tool to make the yarn come behind the latch. Now, place the yarn end into the tool hook and pull it toward you. Knit several rows with the waste yarn. Now cut the waste yarn and remove the weights and comb. Move the carriage slowly to release the knitting from the machine. Leave the 50 needles at the central B position as they are, and push back the empty needles to A position. Place the carriage on the right side. Place the 50 stitches with markers around the neck edge onto the needles, with the wrong side of the knitwork facing you. Now, rehang the comb and wait. Set the row counter to 0. Now knit 60 rows for the collar using the main yarn. Transfer the right end needle stitch to the left side needle, which is then pulled to E position. First, wind the yarn around the stem of that needle, place it onto the hook. Don't make the stitches too tight. Then return the needle to B position and make 1 stitch. Repeat this up to the last stitch, then pull the yarn through to secure the stitches. The back bodice has been knit. Next, the front work the same way as you've done in the back. Next, we'll make the sleeves. This is a sleeve pattern. You start a sleeve cup with a width of 60 stitches. Work in the same way as you did the mock rib of the hem. You put every other needle of the 30 in B position on each side. Place the carriage on the left end of the needle bed with the tension dial set to 2. The order and procedure of knitting are just the same as in the hem preparation for the front and the back bodice. This is the completed hem of the sleeve edge. Now, knit the sleeve itself, increasing stitches. Set the tension dial to 6 and the row counter to 0. First, knit 3 rows. Bring forward the needle adjacent to the end needle on the carriage side to B position. Knit 1 row and then again push the needle next to the carriage side end needle to B position. In this manner, you knit 3 rows adding 1 stitch and knit 1 row adding 1 stitch on the same side as the carriage. Repeat this pattern until you reach row 101. Then knit 10 rows without adding stitches. The sleeve has been knitted. Break the yarn, leaving a length of about 3 times the knitting width. Next, knit a few more rows with the waste yarn and release the work from the machine. Knit the other sleeve in the same manner. Now, the blocking and pressing for the garment pieces and sleeves. First, cut the last stitch of the waist knitting in the mock rib area and draw the yarn on the opposite side. It can be removed quite easily. Next, lay the garment pieces the wrong side up and arrange the shape and size. Fix them with pins and press, avoiding the mock rib area. Now, turn them over and press gently. Next, join the shoulders. First, push 26 needles to B position. Hold the piece with the right side of the front facing you. Fold the waist knitting toward you. Pick up the shoulder stitches and place them onto the needles. Then, carefully hold the knitting against the needle bed and push the needles to E position. Next, you hold the piece with the wrong side of the back facing you. Fold the waist knitting away from you. Pick up the shoulder stitches and place them onto the hooks of the same needles. When this work is over, return all the needles to B position. Then, the stitches of the front and back garment pieces are made into a single stitch on the hook of each needle. After making a few rows of waist knitting, you'll bind off the stitches. Put a tapestry needle through the left end stitch. Next, pass the needle through the stitches of the next needle and the left end needle. Repeat this pattern. Remove the waist knitting for shoulders by moving the carriage. The shoulder has been joined. Now, join the bodice and sleeves. Remove the waist knitting for the bodice. Push 110 needles to B position. With the right side facing you, place the armhole stitches between markers evenly. Stitch onto the needles. Then push the needles to E position. This time, the wrong side of the sleeve is facing you. Place the stitches into the needle hooks. and push the needles back to B position to make a single stitch. Knit several rows with the waste yarn. Let's bind off all stitches with a tapestry needle. Move the carriage slowly to take off the knitting work. This work is all finished by removing the waste knitting. Now the joining of knitted pieces. The parts, order and direction of stitching are shown in the illustration here. First, let's place seam edges side by side with the wrong side up. Beginning with the first row of the mock rib, join the seams stitch by stitch by sewing down between the rows. Then, turn the knitting and join the pieces in the same manner. The side pieces will be stitched from the sinker loop, one stitch inside, up to the underarm position. You'll stitch down the sleeve seam starting with the wrong side of the sleeve cuff. Then, join the right side seam upward to the underarm. Join the collar. Stitch down along the sinker loop, one stitch inside starting with the wrong side. The excess yarn produced at the beginning and end of knitting or when changing the yarns can be sewn into the knitting itself. For the finish, press lightly, beginning with the wrong side. Then, turn the sweater over to the right side and press it lightly. Do it carefully, particularly along the seams. You have finished your first sweater. How do you like it? This time you'll learn to knit a lady's pullover sweater. This sweater is for a 96 centimeter bust. The finished size is supposed to be 108. Set the tension dial to 7. The tension swatch is to have 18 stitches and 24 rows in a 10 centimeter square. You'll start with the back bodice piece. Every other needle between the left 48th and the right 48th needles is pushed to B position. Place the carriage at the left-hand side of the needle bed. Set the tension dial to 7. Knit one row with waste yarn. Hang the cast-on comb and the claw weight. Then push the empty needles to B position. At this time, be sure to push to B position the 48th needle on the right. Knit a few rows of waist knitting, ending with the carriage at the right. First, let's knit 60 rows up to the underarm position. Set the row counter to 0. Change to the main yarn and knit 60 rows to the underarm. When you have knitted 60 rows, cast off 5 stitches on both sides respectively. First, the right side stitches should be cast off. Place the end stitch on the second needle. Pull this needle to D position. Place the yarn on the hook and push it back to B position. Repeat this work to end with 2 stitches remaining. Return empty needles to A position and knit 1 row. Next, cast off 5 stitches on the left. Then knit 69 rows up to the shoulder. The row counter reads 130. Now, to show the neck opening here, place yarn markers on sinker loops between the 16th and the 17th on the right and left. After several rows of waist knitting, remove the work. The back bodice has been knitted. Knit the front bodice in the same manner up to row number 108, where we will begin the neckline shaping. Push 47 needles from the left 43rd to the right 4th to E position. Set the holding cam lever to H. Do not knit the left shoulder. Hang the claw weight again at each end of the knitting. Set the row counter to 0. Knit 1 row. Here, cast off 4 stitches at the left end of the right shoulder. Decrease the stitches with a transfer tool, like this. Next, you knit 2 rows and decrease 2 stitches. Repeat 1 more time. You'll then decrease 1 stitch every 2 rows. Repeat this pattern 4 times. There will be 27 stitches left when you have finished decreasing. After that, keep on knitting until the row counter reads 22. You have now finished the right shoulder portion. Make a few rows of waist knitting and remove the weight. Release the knitting from the machine. Next, follows the left shoulder portion. Place the carriage at the left-hand side. The empty needles are pushed back to A position. Then move the 39 needles from the 43rd to the 5th, all on the left, back to D position. Leave the 8 needles in the center at E position. Hang the claw weights on and set the row counter to 0. Knit the left shoulder in the same manner as the right one. But the work pattern will be reversed this time because you will be decreasing stitches at the right-hand side. Knit 22 rows and you will have finished the left side. After some waist knitting, remove the knitting from the machine. Move the empty needles back to A position and set the holding cam lever to N. Then knit a few rows of waste yarn and you are finished. Here's the completed front bodice piece. Now the sleeves. This is the sleeve pattern. Starting with the 58 stitch edge, you'll gradually add stitches while you knit. Set the tension dial to 7 and knit in waste yarn. Set the row counter to 0. When knitting the sleeve, at every 4th row, add 1 stitch on the right, knit 1 row and add 1 stitch on the left as you knit up to the 94th row. After the 94th row, further knit 7 rows without adding stitches. Now, break the yarn, leaving a length of about 3 times the width of the knitting. After knitting a few rows in waste yarn, release the work from the machine. Now, one sleeve has been completed. Knit the other sleeve in the same manner. For blocking and pressing of the bodice and sleeves, work in the same manner as you did for sweater number 1. Let's make hems for the bodice. Push the 85 needles to B position. Place the carriage at the left-hand side and set the tension dial to 5. Hold the front side bodice piece with the wrong side facing you. Pick up at one end the sinker loops of the first row worked in the main yarn and overlap 2 stitches on every 8th needle. Hang the comb and weights and set the row counter to 0. Knit 18 rows with the main yarn. Remove the weights and the comb. Then break the yarn, leaving 3 times the width of the work. Push the needles to E position. Then return them to D position. pick up the sinker loops of the first row and hook them onto the corresponding needles. After hanging them, push the needles back to B position to make a single stitch. Knit in waste yarn, then bind off all stitches with a tapestry needle. Take the work from the machine and remove the waste knitting. To knit the hem for the sleeve, push 39 needles to B position. Overlap the sinker loops of the sleeve, one onto every other needle. The rest can be worked in the same way as in making of the bodice hem. The hem has been completed. Next comes the joining of the right shoulder. This can also be done in the same way as that of sweater number 1. Bring 27 needles forward to B position. The front and back bodice pieces are put together inside out. Bind off all stitches with a tapestry needle. The right shoulder has been joined. The neckband is knit like hem knitting. Set the tension dial to 5. Place the carriage at the left-hand side and move the 86 needles to B position. Then, with the wrong side of the bodice now joined at one shoulder facing you, pick up the neck edge stitches and place them onto the needles. The rest is done in the same order and manner as in the plain hem preparation. When the knitting is completed, fold it like a plain hem and join. But in this case, take the sinker loops on the second row and place them onto the needles. The neckband is now complete. Then, join the left shoulder in the same manner as the right one. The sleeves are attached to the bodice as in sweater number 1. The bodice and sleeves are put together by 104 needles inside out. The sleeves have been attached to the bodice. Here are the joined seams. The garment pieces, order, and the direction of the joined seams are shown in the illustration. Now, with the wrong side up, seaming begins with the first row of the hem. Turn it back to the right side and stitch up to the underarm. Next, the sleeve edge stitching begins with the wrong side. It's turned back to the right side and is joined up to the underarm. We leave 3 centimeters open for joining the bodice. We'll sew the short seam at the underarm. From the front, insert the needle in through the stitch and back out through the next stitch. Then, pass the needle through the sinker loop 1 stitch inside. Repeat this pattern. The collar seams are also stitched, first on the inside and then on the outside. Press your completed garment as you did in sweater number 1. Now, let's learn how to knit a lady's cardigan. The finished measurement will be 112 centimeters to fit a 96 centimeter bust. For stocking stitch tension, set the dial to 8. The tension swatch is to have 17 stitches and 23 rows in a 10 centimeter square. We will start with the back bodice. Every other needle between the left 46th and the right 46 needles inclusive is pushed to B position. The carriage is placed at the left-hand side, and the tension dial is set to 5. Knit a few rows in waste yarn, ending with the carriage at the right side. First, let's knit 20 rows for the bottom hem. Set the row counter to 0, change to the main yarn and knit 20 rows. You'll now make a 2 by 1 rib by using a latchet tool. Remove the stitch on the 3rd needle from the right and unknit it by pushing it with the latchet tool. Insert the latchet tool stem deep into the 1st row stitch while pulling the knitting downward. Next, catch the sinker loops from the upper row and pull them toward you. Continue this operation until you come to the final stitch. Then, put it back onto the empty needle. Produce a rib at every 3rd stitch. Set the tension dial to 8 and set the row counter back to 0. Knit 70 rows to the underarm, decreasing 5 stitches on each side. After knitting 70 rows, decrease 5 stitches on the carriage side. Knit 1 row and decrease 5 stitches on the carriage side. Following this, knit 57 rows up to the shoulder. When you have knitted the 58th row, place markers on sinker loops between 16 and 17 on each side to indicate the neck opening. Knit in waste yarn and the back bodice has been completed. Now, the front knitting begins. Select needles from 1 to 47 on the right. Knit 20 rows for the bottom hem in the same way as the back. Use the latchet tool to make a 2 by 1 rib. Then, knit 70 rows to the underarm and decrease 5 stitches on the right-hand side. Place a marker at the left edge of the knitwork. Hang the weights on both sides. Keep on knitting while decreasing stitches at the left and to shape the neck opening. Knit 2 rows and decrease 1 stitch using a 2-eyed transfer tool. Repeat this 7 times. You'll further decrease 1 stitch at every 4 rows, repeating it 10 times. The number of stitches will decrease to 25. Knit an additional 4 rows without reducing stitches. The row counter now reads 128. The right front piece has just been completed. The left front should be knitted likewise to serve as a symmetrical counterpart. Next, you'll knit sleeves. Like the hem of the bodice side of the knitting, knit a sleeve edge with 50 stitches and 20 rows and make a 2x1 rib. For the knitting of sleeves, set the tension dial to 8 and the row counter to 0. When knitting sleeves, after every 4 rows, increase by 1 stitch on the right. Then knit 1 row to the left, increased by 1 stitch. Repeat this pattern 8 times. Then, increase 1 stitch at the right after every 6 rows. Continue to knit 1 row to the left, increased by 1 stitch. Repeat 9 times to make a total of 88 rows. Then, knit 5 rows without increasing stitches. Leave a length of main yarn about 3 times the width of knitting. Knit a few rows with waste yarn. Knit the other sleeve in the same manner. Next, knit the neckband in 2x1 rib. Push the 32 needles to B position. Knit 10 rows at the tension dial 5. Make a 2x1 rib. The neckband has just been knitted. The button band is produced with 119 needles. It is made in a way similar to the neckband. To make the buttonhole band, knit 4 rows with 119 needles. A buttonhole position can be determined this way. Make a purl stitch at the determined position and move the stitch to the next needle. There are 5 buttonholes. After knitting 6 rows, make a 2x1 rib. The button band and the buttonhole band are now knitted. The final row is done by back stitch technique. From the front, insert the needle in through the stitch. Skip 1 stitch. From the back, pass the needle through the stitch. Repeat this pattern until you reach the left-hand edge. Again, sweater number 1 provides a model pattern for the blocking and the pressing of the bodice front, back sides, and sleeves. Join shoulder seams as in sweater number 1. Place the front and back bodice onto 25 needles inside out. Use the tapestry needle to bind off stitches. Now, both shoulders have just been joined. You'll next learn the proper way of joining the buttonhole band to the bodice. Except for the different number of stitches, both buttonhole and neck bands can be prepared in a similar way. First, bring forward 119 needles to the B position. With the right side of the front facing you, pick up stitches evenly along the neck opening and place them onto the needles. Push the needles to E position. Now, with the wrong side of the buttonhole band facing you, pick up the stitches from the first row to place them onto the needle hooks. Push the needles back to B position to make a single stitch. Then, use the tapestry needle to bind off the stitches of the row knitting in the main yarn. Likewise, join the button band to the left front neck opening and the neck band to the back neck of the back bodice. Attach the sleeves to the bodice in the same manner as sweater number 1. But the needles used in this case total 84. With the wrong side of the sleeve facing you, use the tapestry needle to bind off all stitches. Next, joining the seams. The illustration shows the parts, the order, and the direction of stitching. The 2x1 rib is closed with back stitch. First, place the edges of the waist portion side by side, the right side facing you and the stitch starting with the first row of the welt. The stitching will extend to the underarm. Sleeves are stitched from the sleeve cuff to the underarm, leaving a 3 cm opening. We'll sew this short underarm seam the same way as in sweater number 2. Using blanket stitch, work around buttonholes with a tapestry needle starting with the right side. After pressing the finished garment, attach 5 buttons on the button band. Here's a completed lady's cardigan. We hope you enjoy creating your own beautiful knitwear. The Knitter offers you a wide variety of knitting pleasures. We hope that you will be spending many enjoyable hours knitting for yourself, your family, and your home.